Hi, class. I just want you all to know that I recorded 22 minutes of a video just now on my computer and there was no sound. um, I'm a little bit annoyed, but these are the technological problems that we have to work through in order to, you know, deliver our content online. This will be a short video. I'm mostly just checking in with you all. Um, Given the nature of the changes that we have been asked to make recently, and really hoping that you all are doing well. Um, I care more about your well being. I care about your health. I care about your happiness. And I care more about that than I care about, the grading and the rubrics by which you will be evaluated. Because that seems to be an incorrect thing to care about when there's a global pandemic. And I think that what we should care about mostly is how are we going to live given the nature of the kinds of forces that we are up against. This is a question that is staged and has been staged in the history of sort of African American thought, certainly the history of African diasporic thought, the history of sort of Black thought, resisting the kind of practices of dominance and violence that have been foundational for the practices of Western um, dominance and its violence. And so the first thing I want to do, and I did this in the first video too, is I want to read to you the email that I sent to you about fear. And I want to read it because I think that hearing it in my voice and in my cadence and in my tone will give you a sense for the way that I was trying to convey something to you. Um, and so I want to read that. Then I'll share a few thoughts about our world and some thoughts about imagination and fear. And then we can discuss later. And so the email, if I titled it anything, would be called It's Okay to Be Afraid. It's okay to be afraid. I've posted this statement about being afraid across different social media platforms the last couple of weeks and days, really. It's okay to be afraid. These past days have felt very fuzzy and gray to me, very difficult to find the correct energies to think about syllabi and course rubrics. I'm concerned about my family. I'm thinking about my friends, and I'm hoping everyone is well. I'm going to parks in order to walk. No one is there, so it's okay. I'm concerned about my well being and those I hold dear. And I care about you all too, how you're doing, how you're making out with so many changes in so little time, the demands this makes on our bodies, the stress, the fear. It's okay to be afraid. I posted for folks that follow me, yes, but I also posted over and over again because I need the reminder too, because I feel afraid too. And fear is not something to shun, but an emotion to honor, like any other emotion. So we can honor our fear, sit with it, let it be with us. Because it is only through treating it as sacred. Sacred because the emotion betrays to us something about our desires and our hopes. It reminds us that we are indeed alive and not numb to it all, that we retain the capacity to feel. To be afraid is another way to say, I am alive. And to be alive is to be sacred. In the past few weeks of class, I have been conversing with you all about imagination. saying that I watch cartoons and I paint and I try to make sound art and dance because imagination is a reflex we have to exercise daily. We can't call upon it on times only in times of duress and despair and expect it to do its magic. We have to cultivate a practice of imagination, kind of like the Muppet Babies. And if you've never seen the show, you should Google it, watch it. It's kind of fun. But as I have also been saying, imagination ain't easy. Imagination isn't something that is frivolous or luxuriant and reserved for the elite or the moneyed or the normal. Imagination is work. It takes fortitude and commitment and courage. It takes courage to live imagination as practice, as a way of life. Black folks have had to practice imagination as an urgent mode of resistance to and against dominance, to and against violence. Black life is an imagined life insofar as white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, insofar as racial capitalism as a form of exploitation, would have us all dead and spiraling towards death without attempts to live, without attempts to breathe, without attempts to say no to these conditions, without attempts to create alternatives in the here, in the now. To talk about the souls of Black folks and grief, to talk about art practices of Black folks and creativity, to contend for rights domestically and against war and global dominance is the practice of Black imagination. And today I want to remind you that imagination towards the possible isn't easy, but we can and must strive for it. Breathe. Otherwise, possibility is the phrase I've been using to say that what we have is not all that is possible. That alternatives to the normative can exist, already exist in this world. Maroons, enslaved people that escaped plantations and created lives in the woods and swamp interiors, engaged the dangerous practice of imagining other kinds of relations to one another, to the earth, to the world. And after imagining, they put into practice the desires they imagined. Imagination, the practice of otherwise possibility, is not the lack of fear. It does not mean one is not afraid. Imagination, the practice of otherwise possibility, is the recognition of and honoring as sacred fear and being afraid, and moving in the direction of the alternative anyway, anyhow, in spite of. Black life isn't lived in absence of fear, but is a kind of courageous wisdom fashioned in the face of fear to continue to breathe and become otherwise. This is our time, in other words. It has always been our time to practice alternatives. It's okay to be afraid of what is to come because there is so much unknown, so much that is uncertain. But we are here. I'm not concerned with grades and quizzes, but about your well-being, about your capacity for care, about your ability to imagine alternatives. I often write the phrase, make art, find your joy, to friends and across social media platforms. I want to encourage you in these coming weeks to engage the practice of imagination as a kind of art making. Find something beautiful every day, whether a passage in a book or a poem, a piece of art, a color, a flower, a sensation. If you'd like, you can share it during the open lectures with us, but it's primarily an exercise for yourself. With hopes that you are breathing, Professor C. What I am hoping for us to do, at least for the next couple of weeks in this class, is to read about global health and its relation to practices of racialization in our world. And so the ways that I'm trying to think about the sort of current crisis that we are calling this global pandemic are not discrete. They are not separable from the ongoing practice of racialization, classism, nativism in terms of sort of nation states, but intersects with these ideas in order for us to really think about how African American studies as a collection of thoughts, ideas, and interdisciplines has always been trying to think about the problem of sort of global dominance and its violence. And so I want us to think really deeply about the ways, for example, if we think about the medical industrial complex, sort of the place where people go for health and healing, medicine, right? That we cannot think of medicine as a practice, as a neutral and unbiased zone from which care and concern happens. That's just not the case. We know, for example, that Black women across class experience violence in hospitals when they attempt to deliver babies. And this is that the practices of the medical industrial complex intersect with race and gender, such that the practices of prenatal care is deeply violent in ways that cut across class for Black women. And so the place where health is supposed to happen, medicine, is the place that withholds care in terms of medicine based on racial and gender intersections, right? And this happens whether you are Beyonce, Serena Williams, or if you are a working class Black woman. That the kinds of care that you are given are deeply influenced by how you show up racially and gendered. Or we can think about the practices of sort of the withholding of medicine. It has been documented, for example, that when Black people attempt to name their pain to doctors and nurses, that doctors and nurses believe because someone is Black, that the pain that they can endure is more than a person who is not Black. And so this is another way that race intersects with the medical industrial complex, such that someone is harmed through a place that is supposed to practice neutral and unbiased care over folks that are in physical pain. But because you are a Black person, you are thought to be able to endure more pain. And so you will be given less medicine or a lower dosage of medicine. It will be less believed that you are in pain, or it will be believed that because you are a Black person, you can endure the pain, so it's okay, right? And so we cannot think of a global pandemic without respect of or on the side of things like the ongoing practice of racialization and the violence that attends racialization. And so for me, one of the things I've been deeply concerned about and have been thinking about as one primary example is my father's church in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey. Mostly working class, working poor Black congregation, lots of members over the age of 60, lots of women. And across age, lots of immunocompromised people. What does one do when that is the makeup of one's congregation? I've been deeply worried, deeply concerned about what is this congregation going to do in a place like Newark, New Jersey, which is population dense, where there are a lot of people that are living in close proximity to one another, such that the spread of the virus is much more communicable and quick because of the proximity in which people live with one another. So this is not just a sort of abstract set of concepts and concerns. This is very real for me. I'm really concerned about like the people that I know and their health and their well-being and wanting them to be well. And so I do not think of the next couple of weeks that we have with each other as a luxury. It's not time off, but I do think of it as like the difficulty of contending with the world in which we live. The seriousness with which the work that we do has to be taken. I have tried to impress upon you all that the work of African American studies, the work of Black studies is not like the work of frivolity. It's not a luxury. right? This is life and death. And what African American studies is attempting to do in its various pressures and weights and intensities is to say that Black folks live and Black folks deserve to live. And so, how can we cultivate a practice toward the livingness of Black life? And so, we have to honor, it seems to me, if we go back to our first week in Du Bois, we have to honor the way that it feels. We have to honor the way that it feels today, a certain kind of intensity that is not new, right? If you are differently, if you are a disabled person, you are recognizing very quickly that the changes that a lot of people have been able to make in terms of working from home very quickly, in terms of home delivery for groceries, in terms of sharing of money through Venmo and Cash App, that things that folks in the disabled community have been having to fight for. If we had paid attention to the Black disabled community, for example, we wouldn't have to do the heavy lifting of thinking of these practices as new or novel. That if we center in our sort of practices of care on a daily basis, folks who are marginalized, folks who are vulnerable to systems of inequity and violence, if we center them in our analyses and in our practices, perhaps it would be easier for us to imagine other kinds of possibilities and to put into practice those other kinds of practices. It wouldn't have to be put into place because they would already be in place, right? And so, one of the things that I want us to really do is to really think about one, how is the rapid response a rapid response that should have been in place for vulnerable peoples anyway? Lots of folks are poor. Most of the folks are poor. Like this is a result of the political economy called capitalism. That most folks are working poor, right? And so if you think about, for example, on our campus, UVA, firing the service workers who work in the cafeterias and food service, who are contracted workers for Aramark, the rationale that is given is, oh, they can apply for unemployment benefits, right? But if you get paid a salary, why would you need unemployment benefits, right? And so, what the people who work for Aramark also lose by being laid off is health benefits. And they lose health benefits at the same time that we're engaging in a global pandemic, which seems not only just wrong, but like evil, right? And we have to think of, well, who is the sort of racial and class and gender sort of who is the majority of the folks that are the service workers for the university who have been laid off so they can receive unemployment benefits? Who are those folks, right? And so we have to think really deeply about the ways the global pandemic is intersecting with our various modes of identification, because we have not contended with the ways our modes of identification continue to marginalize people. And so my concern is the ways that this will be deeply inflected through the prism of racialization, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, etc. And so for the next couple of weeks, I really want us to think deeply about this pandemic. And more than that, I really want us to think about the urgency of the time that we have on the earth, not in class, but our time that we inhabit this thing called earth. What are the kind of people that you want to be? What is the kind of life that you want to live? And the last thing I'll say is something that I really want to think with you all about. And you can tell me what you think. You don't have to agree, but tell me what you think. I have been most recently thinking about imagination and fear, right? And the thing that I have been really thinking about is the way it seems to me fear does not precede or exist before imagination and its enactment. It seems to me that fear is the byproduct, it is the effect of the enactment of an imagination towards otherwise possibility. towards the idea of alternatives perhaps being possible. That fear is not a thing that exists of itself, but fear is the thing that exists once imagination is produced. I think of children, young kids who imagine that there are, monsters under the bed, or imagine that there's a monster in the closet, right? That it is that they don't fear going to sleep just because they fear going to sleep, right? They fear going to sleep because they imagine that there is this thing under or in that will harm them, right? And so I think of that as a particular kind of model for thinking of the relationship between fear and imagination. That fear is the thing that is produced once you have imagined the monster. Fear is the thing that is produced once you have imagined another kind of relation to the world, to other people, to the earth. I think this is important because I think that we tend to have a directional problem in terms of what we think white supremacy is, in terms of what we think blackness is, and I think in terms of what we think imagination is. What do I mean by a directional problem? I think that we think that things come before that actually come after. I have been trying to talk about, and I think I've talked about it with you all, white supremacy as the thing that is produced by renouncing relationship to blackness, right? That you want that white supremacy is the desire to be normal, a normal kind of person. That heterosexuality as a concept, as an idea, straightness as a concept and idea is produced through the renunciation of or the relinquishing of relation to queer possibility, a thing that exists previous to it, relation as possible. That you only get the normative after you relinquish your relation to the thing that it precedes it. It seems to me that white supremacy is that thing. That white supremacy as a practice of normative understandings of what it means to be a human, white landed male gentry, is by renouncing relation to all other kinds of ways of being human and in relation to those other kinds of ways to be human, right? That if white supremacy is that, it seems to me that what blackness is the refusal to renounce relation to the non-normative in the service of becoming normal, right? If that is the case, I think of blackness as imagination. And I think of blackness as imagination insofar as I think that what interrupts the practice of blackness or the desire to interrupt the practice of blackness as a dissident kind of ongoing force of the non-normative, I think is the law. The law is the thing that is produced in order to tell you this is how you're supposed to live, this is how you're supposed to breathe, this is how you're supposed to eat, this is how you're supposed to relate to one another in terms of relation, right? The law is the thing that is used in order to produce the normative relation to the world, right? And so the law is the thing that is called upon in order to interrupt the practice of blackness in the service of producing the normative. And so you relinquish your relation to blackness through the law in order to become normal, right? I think of blackness as imagination insofar as it seems to me that what imagination is the thing that precedes the thing called fear. That it's imagination that's the thing that's constantly being practiced, imagination for various kinds of relations, various kinds of worlds, various kinds of possibilities. And that fear is the thing that is produced once imagination is produced. And that fear is the thing then that comes to interrupt your capacity for imagination in the service of producing something like normative thinking, right? That in order to think properly, in order to think correctly about the world and your inhabitation of it, you have to relinquish your relation to imaginative capacity. And so for me, imagination and blackness are kind of the same thing. And that fear and the law are kind of the same thing. And that what we have to do is constantly refuse the relinquishing of our relation to blackness and imagination in the service of the flourishing of life. And so help me think about what the relationship between imagination and fear is, so that we might produce more just relations with one another, so that we might produce more just relations to each other and to our families and our friends, to people that we know and people that we don't know, and to the earth, such that more people can be fed, can be clothed, and can be cared for in a very generous and charitable and ongoing way. So that's all I have for now. I look forward to talking to you